Definitely groups' approaches to membership and new members makes a big difference to the flavor of the culture. At Dancing Rabbit, because we're intending to be a village of between 500 and 1,000 people, we are looking for a lot of new members, and so we have a very active visitor program and a pretty proactive invitation to people to come and look and spend time here. We also do tours every Saturday during the summer, and so there's a lot of public coming in and out. And I think that for a community that is as proactive about it as Dancing Rabbit is, it definitely affects the community. Part of it is that the population is rarely stable for very long, which means that you're constantly integrating new faces and you're constantly answering the same 10 questions that the last 16 people have asked, and it can definitely get draining on people. So there's that part of it. And Dancing Rabbit's not the only one. When I lived at Eastwind, it was very similar. There were just a lot of new faces around all the time. And you also, particularly with a group that is as mission-driven as Dancing Rabbit is, I mean, we're in this to change the world and to be, doing our piece of sending that ripple out, and it means that we get a lot of press, we do a lot of interviews, you're constantly on display, and that's part of what people are asked to be okay with when they move here. Even if they're not going to be the one in front of the camera and answering the questions and doing all that, they still have to have their lives be display material to some extent. And I think that it takes a certain type of person to be okay with that. And so we tend to attract those people that, that are more outgoing and that, have a flair for a bit of exhibitionism. I think that's part of who we attract, or at least people who are willing to be tolerant of that, to some degree. So that definitely affects it. And I think that groups that are, smaller and wanting to stay smaller, there's a depth to the long-term connection that I don't know that we're ever going to get at Dancing Rabbit. I mean, there's a way that you can spend, like if you can spend 25 years with the same group of people, basically the same 6 to 8 to 10 people, there is a type of bonding and connection and real sense of being there for each other that I think is harder to get in a group like the one that we have where, there's a constant changing batch of characters. I think that you also get some pretty deep power dynamics in groups that are, like Dancing Rabbit is, where there's the people who have been here now forever in the Dancing Rabbit timeline and the people who are newer coming in. And I think that there are challenges on both sides of those dynamics, where there's the people who feel like, boy, they wish there were other people who knew as much as they did and they didn't have to be constantly bringing other people along. But they also have a certain amount of power just by speaking in the group, that whether they want it or not, that's a reality of being around for a long time. And new people can have a hard time even figuring out what's going on in a meeting because they haven't yet sussed out what all those dynamics are and who all the players are and who has history with who and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's some interesting things that happen in groups where, if you're together with the same group of people for 20 years, it's like everybody's on much more of an even playing field at that point. So I think the power dynamics get accentuated in groups like ours. I think that we are really fortunate at Dancing Rabbit that the people who have the longest standing power in the group are really aware of it. I don't actually know when the last time was that there was a formal conversation about it, but I think that the founders here are pretty self-aware and are trying to make consistent efforts to not necessarily diminish their own power, but bring other people up and through the ranks and like have things evened out and back out of roles so that they don't become essential or irreplaceable in people's minds and that kinds of thing. So I do think that it's important to talk about it, and I do think it's important to be aware of it, and I don't think there's a way to change the fact that different humans exert different amounts of influence on a group, and that's really what power dynamics are about at some level. Is it's like really about influence and how much people take your ideas seriously and that kind of thing. And there's a lot of ways that people get power in a group, and so I think it's an unavoidable swath of group dynamics, and I think that the more people who are at the top of the spoken or unspoken hierarchy can be aware of it, the better it's going to go for other people. And I think that new people not being timid is really helpful. That I don't don't think the people who've been around for a long time here want them to hold themselves back and not feel like they can participate. So I think that the more proactive the newer people can be, the better it is for everybody. But it also takes time for different people to want to step in. I do know groups that have regular conversations about it and get very explicit about it and really put things in place to try to mitigate the power dynamics in some way. And there's always a little bit of awkwardness, I think, to trying to wrench it in some way. And I don't know that that's a bad thing to do. I think that sometimes you need to go through a little bit of awkwardness in order to even things out, and I think that can be a good thing. But I do think the groups need to think about it and be aware of it, because the groups that don't are the ones that really get themselves into trouble. So at Dancing Rabbit, we have specific visitor periods each year that people come for 1 to 3 weeks, and there's a bunch of orientations that happen during that time, which are pretty important because they give people a sense of, like, how do the economics work? What does sustainability mean? What is consensus? So, you know, how does the food scene work? All that kind of stuff. So there's that nuts and bolts training aspect of the membership process. And then somebody can request to become a member, and they write a letter, and what's in, I don't even remember exactly what we just approved.
I forget all the small details.
Well, it's a combination of you know, writing letters stating your intent and being interviewed and getting a chance for actual FaceTime and getting feedback from the current members once you've been here for a little while about how they feel like you're fitting in and what you could be working on and what you could be doing differently, and then watching how that person responds to the feedback. So all of those things are part of the membership process. We operate by consensus at Dancing Rabbit, so you have to be consented upon by the membership, and that's not as scary as it sounds, because I think people rarely get an outright no from Dancing Rabbit, even though it would only technically take one person to block someone becoming a member. It doesn't actually happen that often that somebody gets an outright no. Sometimes they get an extension, like, let's try it for a little longer because we're really not sure how well this is working and we think it might be okay, but we're not sure. A lot of groups have less formalized and less steps involved with their membership process. At Eastwind, you basically come for a 3-week visit, and then you apply to be a provisional member, and assuming that a number of people don't object, you get to stay for a year, and at the end of the year you get voted on. And sometimes people do get a no with that, but it's very light on the process end of things. And, you know, it's pretty much the, you know, let people sort it out for themselves for the most part, unless somebody is really controversial, and then sometimes people do get turned down. Some groups, like at Sandhill, there's not really a formal process. It's really relationally based. People come in, they try living there for a little while, the group talks about it, you know, and then the group at some point gets comfortable enough to say, hey, do you want to become a member? And so it's much less formalized, which I think smaller groups can get away with doing. So one of the most important relationships in how communities set themselves up is between the group's decision-making process and their membership process. For consensus-based groups, it's really important that there's some kind of membership selection process happening, because one person who really isn't able to hang with the consensus process can be really, really challenging for the group. For groups that operate more on a voting system, there's often more casualness about members because you can get away with that. Like if somebody isn't very process savvy and isn't really interested in talking about stuff and being creative in a meeting setting, that's okay, because that's not a requirement for that group to be able to function smoothly given their decision-making process. So, and sometimes when groups go from being a straight-up consensus model to something less than consensus, their membership process often changes naturally over the course of the next couple of years as the community is readjusting to what the new reality looks like. And at Dancing Rabbit, I think at some point we are going to go through some kind of transition like that, and our membership process will probably, it will certainly shift, whether it gets lighter or less formalized or, you know, something at that point. I don't know what exactly that's going to look like, but we anticipate there'll be some shift in both of those things at some point. You know, right now we're still pretty selective, you know, and we're a consensus-based group that really values social relationships, and we're small still, but that'll change.